Just for your awareness, listener, I am going to be helping to lead a ride with Colorado History Rides on September 20th from 10 a.m. to about noon of the Golden Triangle. It's sort of an old and new look at the Golden Triangle, so we're going to talk about history. There is a story I have been just absolutely so excited to tell that I've been looking for the right venue to tell about, old versus new in the Golden Triangle. Should be a lot of fun. I think the suggested donation is like $5 to $15 or something like that. But we'll be meeting at 10 a.m. September 20th, and come along. Look it up online at Colorado History Rides.
Hello, I'm James Warren.
And I'm Andy Cushen.
And this is the Denver Urbanism Podcast, a podcast on all things city building in the same old city of Denver. Well, Andy, today we're going to talk about something in some ways that's a little bit outside our typical ground that we cover. And the reason for this, frankly, is that I love econ. I think it's really cool. Supply and demand make a lot of sense to my brain. And so a lot of things that we talk about have to do with many of the principles of urbanism that are related to supply and demand, right? Why people take specific modes of transit is more or less an economics question. It's a transportation economics question. Why rents go up and down, that's very on its face an economics question. While the built form itself, the way buildings look, has something to do with economics, it's more mired in all kinds of other things than simply two lines converging on a graph. It's a lot more complex than that, and there's a lot more that goes into it. And so because of that, I don't know as much about this, and we've kind of avoided topics that we both couldn't really speak on, but it really does deserve its day in the sun. And you're going to shed some light on it for us today.
As devoted listeners of this podcast know, I am a nerd for permits. I am a nerd for zoning. I spend almost none of my time watching TV or movies, and I spend at minimum an hour of my day every day looking at Denver's permitting system because I'm a curious little guy, and I want to know more.
You know how sometimes you're listening to this show and your friend's like, what are you listening to? And you kind of embarrassingly tell them
no one's embarrassed to listen to
Denver
us.
Urbanism Podcast. Just imagine hanging out with us.
Yeah.
Oh God. Oh God.
But when I have posted then on Build Up Denver on Twitter, or when I have written an article for Denver Infill, and there's been many years of writing now that I've done on the built environment in Denver, it's a constant refrain, a constant question. Why do the buildings all look the same? Why do they look like that? Or just sort of put mean, why do they all have to be so ugly? That kind of frame is the constant refrain that I get from people as I am just showing them what the building is going to look like. I'm not the person who has ever made that decision myself. So I thought it would be worth just clearing the air. Here's the reasons. There you go. Now you know, and that's that.
And specifically, you're not talking about this is the reason a building's ugly. Because, buildings are buildings. People have different opinions about them. I will sometimes look at a building and think it's quite nice looking, and others will say that that thing looks like crap. But we were specifically talking about why does the building look the way it is? And there are kind of some high level points that we can look to explain why a building looks the way it is.
Yes.
What are they?
So I think first and foremost, architecture as a profession exists. And architecture as a discipline, as a sort of something you can study and learn and refine. I think the building code and fire code is a huge constraint on why buildings are shaped the way they are, why they operate the way they do. Material availability and cost is also another constraint. We are not in Greece. You can't get Grecian marble for every downtown building at an affordable rate, so we don't use that.
I know a guy.
Well, a Greek guy who imports it very far away. Profit motive. Return on investment, right? I mean, somebody is going to use the building and they're either going to sort of sell it to someone else to use or they're going to use it themselves. They need to be able to sort of use it productively, and get a return. And lastly, I would say just sort of generally zoning, design review, design guidelines, urban design, etc. All the kind of government regulations that are not related to life safety, but are still being imposed on a project.
So we've got kind of these 5 high-level reasons here. And these reasons are true throughout time. If you went back to the year 2000 and said, well, why are all the buildings in Denver being built more or less the same way, in a fairly similar manner? You would have said, building/fire code. You would have said material availability and cost. You would have said architectural fashion. You would have said profit motive and return on investment. And you would have said zoning, design, standard, design review, right? You would have given those exact same reasons. And even if you went back in history to a time before building code, before fire code, before design review, like, it's not like you would have had other reasons. All of these reasons would have been the same, other than the oddball who builds a mansion because he really wants it to be flashy and really impressive to his neighbors, right? I guess that's architectural fashion.
Yeah, I mean, like, zany people exist. They're out there doing, like, weird things, like, choosing to eat slugs for no reason.
Well, you call me out on the podcast like that. What is this about? I told you that in confidence.
If you were such a person to be inclined
It's too late.
to do something that other people do not do.
This is a live show.
That's something that people then think, oh, what an interesting example. But it's clearly we do not live in a world full of constant zany projects and doors that go wing, when you open them up.
Only.
Those are the 5 reasons, I think, to hit on really quickly.
Let's jump into it. Building code/fire code. How does this make buildings look the way they look?
I mean, so it's important that buildings don't burn down. We have had fire as a problem in human civilization for a long time. Fire's great in some ways, right? You can use it to like cook things, and that's cool. But buildings made of wood burn. And there are many, many, many great cities, United States, other countries, other civilizations that have had their entire city burned down. Great Fire of Rome, Fire of Chicago. There was a fire in Denver back when Denver was a nothing little podunk town. 1863, we had a fire. And so then a building code, a fire code, could be as simple as it was in Rome in the year 60 when they imposed sort of new standards on how close buildings could be together, in order to try and mitigate the spread of fire. Or it could be the fact that in 1864, we then said in Denver, the new buildings that you're building need to be made out of brick.
And you can actually go to the Denver Library and look up the old Denver fire insurance maps. And you look at the old buildings in Denver, and so many of them were processing lumber. So if you as a city are trying to put yourself on the map, be a place where people go, be a place where jobs are, and a lot of those jobs have to do with lumber and lumber processing and shipping timber in and out of the city, it might behoove you to attract insurers to your city. And as a result, to say, look, everybody's got to build out of brick or a fire resistant material. So you have various reasons from life safety to trying to be a bustling economy that you might impose fire code. And those things don't just save lives, they change how we build buildings.
A specific reform that we have discussed on the podcast recently that we have discussed in this vein without maybe ever kind of being so bald about it is that buildings look the way they do because of the fire code. And the fire code requires, building code, fire code, require that when a building is 4 stories or taller, that there has to be 2 means of egress. You have to be able to exit the building at 2 separate points. There's sort of redundancy there. So that way people can escape in the case of a fire.
If one stairwell is on fire, you just run to the other staircase.
Correct. Maybe don't build stairwells that are on fire. And in fact, in the year
Write that down.
2025, it's actually pretty easy to sort of choose to have a part of your building that is most resistant, most resilient in the situation of fire, that has really advanced systems for getting smoke out to make sure that no one suffocates in a stairwell. And so we know that buildings then end up being kind of really long, really kind of squat because of this 2 point of egress sort of system, at minimum 2 point of egress system. We now have a single stair building reform, that happened. That is not a entitlement zoning code reform. That is specifically the state directing local municipalities to make a change to their building code to permit new buildings that have their own new constraints in the building and fire code that then can be built differently and only have one mean of egress, one entry and exit way. Those buildings, so much more can be said about them. But we will then end up with different shaped buildings because they come with their own constraints. As I say, we didn't right now have a rule that required you with your long squat kind of apartment building that you're building in Rhino. You weren't capped at the number of homes in a hallway that you could have, per stair. But one of the concessions then made when you say, let's only have 1 stairwell, is that there will be a cap on the number of homes that can be built on that floor per stairwell in that building. So, that's a real limitation now, again, on the shape and size of a building that can be built with single stair. So the building code, even as it evolves, imposes new constraints, kind of makes new projects permissible. We can choose to change it. I won't get fully into this, but in the year 2010, the International Building Code sort of changed their rules to allow for kind of a simpler construction. So you can have like 2x4 construction on top of a concrete podium. People call that 5/1s. Most of the apartment buildings that you might see kind of close to a light rail stop or something like that are 5/1 construction. That is capped at being basically at its tallest, about 7 stories tall. And once you want to go taller than 7 stories, you can't build that type of construction anymore because the building code says so. So everything about, the shape and size of a building really is implicated in the building code as well.
And so you're hitting on our first answer to why buildings look the way they do in Denver. What you've described with 2 means of egress is that you end up with boxier buildings, right? What you're talking about with 5/1 construction is you're talking about buildings that end up being around the same height as one another. And so when people say, well, why do they all look the same? And often what I'll hear is, why do they look so boxy? This is one of the reasons. You are required by code to build things a certain way. And as a result, everybody's following the same code, which means that everything starts to look similar to one another. That is our first answer. Let's move on to material availability and cost.
Well, again, Denver is in the foothills. It's on the plains, near the foothills, near the Rocky Mountains. Short grass prairie, high desert, etc., whatever you call it, high plains. Material constraints exist, right? In Denver, we are close to mines. We are close to a certain type of lumber that can be easily accessed. And so you see some of our sort of favorite buildings in downtown, like the Brown Palace. That's a sandstone building. Sandstone buildings are not perfect. A lot of architectural nerds are going to tell you that there's like a lot of detailing that gets lost over time. Weathering is pretty quick for sandstone. But the type of then granite or kind of marble or, the type of rock that is available to make a stately building in Denver, Colorado, we take pride in the fact that the Colorado, state capital is mostly Colorado materials that constructed it. So material availability changes over time. We have, through human behaviors, made certain species of wood extinct. We have, through human behaviors, made certain animals extinct. And we have, through human behaviors, invented new processes. And now we have materials that you would not naturally find in nature, but are actually really easy to mass produce, really easy to sort of ship, really easy to replace when they break. And so material availability has changed over time. It's really easy to make glass off-site and ship it in now in a way that glass was a really high value sort of part of your building in 1860.
And again, this is one thing that we look back throughout time and we see, right? Back before it was easy to get materials out, people on the plains would build homes out of mud, out of dirt. They were called sod houses, and they were essentially more like hobbit holes that people would dig, and roofs would often collapse in on them. Why did they do that? Material availability, baby. It was not easy to get wood out there. It wasn't even easy to get bricks. And so people built homes out of dirt. And so too throughout time. People build what they build based on what is available. So what's available today?
You can go to Home Depot and buy 2x4s. You can then use those 2x4s to build something. We have building code that allows you to build things up to a certain height if you're using 2x4s. You can buy concrete at Home Depot. You can buy doors at Home Depot. And so, why does every hallway and every apartment building look the same? Because we have mass production of materials. It is easy to get those materials, to source them, to have them delivered to your site. All of the sort of sealants that we have, I want to shout out. There's a great video by a YouTuber called Stuart Hicks, where he talks about kind of the change from joinery and masonry at the gaps and edges of buildings to just using caulk and sealant for basically every single problem that you encounter in a building. That is a genuine change in technology that we have available to solve problems in building. And in a world where it becomes cheaper to just buy caulk and use caulk to sort of fill gaps than have, specialized masons kind of build a building in order to not need to use caulk, you then have a much easier time, much lower cost changing the type of construction available in your building.
Yes. And so One of the things that we will often see is similar siding, similar facade to one another among different buildings in Denver. And the reason often is just one, you can buy those materials in bulk, and two, they cost a lot less than doing other things. This is how buildings have been built throughout time. Sometimes you'll see an old building that's been preserved or that people have put a premium on because it was built with different type of facade that maybe is a little more aesthetically pleasing. I live in a building that was built in the 1950s that is not very pretty on the outside because they used the cheapest materials, asbestos siding, and then covered that up with the next cheapest materials, vinyl siding. And so that is just what people have done throughout history, and it's what we continue to do today. So that's kind of point number 2. Let's move on to architectural fashion.
So architecture, as I mentioned before, is a discipline. It is something that you go to school to learn to do. At the lowest level, right? Like, you don't need an architect for you as sort of a handy person to kind of build a doghouse. People lived in buildings back before there were 4-year universities and, literacy rates that allowed people to sort of decide that they wanted to be an architect at the age of 12. We have now, though, become a society where if you're building a major project, you do need a certified architect, a certified engineer to sign off on the project, to check your math, to make sure that the building is structurally sound. Architecture as a discipline has its own preferences. Architects were taught to make buildings and to know that they were sort of successful, to know that they have been done successfully by people who have made those buildings before them and have their own preferences. And so we do have genuinely architectural fashions. Somebody asked on Twitter, or maybe Blue Sky, they asked me, why don't we do Art Deco anymore?
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, because we don't. Because that changed, right? Art Deco, we now have a label for that.
Right.
But actually at the time when people were sort of embracing new materials in the 1920s and a sort of, real announcement of skyscrapers and sort of new technological innovations in the sort of facade of the building materials themselves, that was just what people were doing with the materials available. We now look back and call that Art Deco. We didn't Art Deco wasn't termed until the 1960s, after people had long since stopped building Art Deco. And so, if you want to then, as an architect in 2025, make a building which you think is like neo Art Deco, you are doing that because you are an educated person and because you have convinced your client that somehow that's going to help you stand out, right? And so the buildings look the same because we are producing architects that are all kind of learning in one discipline and tradition, and they are applying what they have learned to the same sort of problem over and over and over again. And we will find over time that the buildings, even if the same material was available, and even if the same sort of zoning constraints were the same, and they're not going to be, this would change over time, but largely the buildings that are produced in a given decade will look more like each other in that decade than a building in a given decade looks like something from 5 decades before.
And we have a couple examples of that here in Denver.
Yeah, really kind of curious, interesting, because of the material availability and the legislation that required us to build buildings with bricks for a very long time in Denver. The international style is sort of a, significant modernist movement in architecture. And Denver is one of only few places really in the country where you can see kind of high international style residences that are made of brick. That is completely atypical for the international style. So does that mean that they're wrong and dumb, because they were made of brick instead of being made of the material that maybe Corbusier or somebody like that would actually want to build? No, it's an architect who's taking a tradition and a discipline and is sort of an exciting innovation in the discipline and applying it to the case of this sort of specific site with the specific materials available and the specific rules.
Though I'm sure you can find some articles from back in the day, I should have done this, bemoaning that we are building the international style out of brick. It's just what people do. People don't like new stuff all that much. But I digress. Architectural fashion is our third reason. Next, let's move on to profit motive and return on investment.
So again, all of human history exists, and there are lots of reasons people do things altruistically. We have lots of churches, they exist. But if you are building a business, you are, constructing your storefront in order to attract people into your door. You are, constructing your business in order to operate so that you can successfully sell your products or services. And if you are commissioning a new building to be built for your business, businesses change over time, and so the buildings change to suit the business needs. A warehouse that is built now in the year 2025 doesn't look very much like a warehouse that was built in 1825. And that's okay. Both of those sort of explanations, though, for why the building is built the way it is can really be explained by the fact it's going to be used by somebody and it needs to be useful. And the person who is building it probably wants to get another commission to do another warehouse, somewhere else. So whether you are operating the building yourself as the developer or the person sort of deciding to build an ADU in your backyard, whatever it is, there is someone somewhere that cares about the building being useful, about the building sort of allowing them to have a usable life, usable space, perhaps a profit on the building. Additionally, I think I'll sprinkle a zoning thing in here, which is that in a world where 75% of a given city, is zoned to be single family only, then if you are one of the people who are lucky enough to own a parcel where you can build something more than a single family house, that's an inflated price for that parcel of land. If you're going to build something on that land, you are probably not building like 2 homes, but you're probably building 100 homes because you can make more money with this sort of scarcity. You love supply and demand here, James.
Now we're talking.
By building more and building more at the cost and sort of with the building materials and in the style of building that allows you to sort of confidently know that people are going to then rent that building and that you can get a lot of people in the building. And the difference between 90 people and 100 people like on one plot of land is really significant, for the margins of somebody who wants to build a building. It's not that many people who would take the sort of lower number of, the lower number on return.
And so what I'm hearing you say is that we are building buildings in a specific way to meet current economic conditions. Part of that is just like maximizing the land that you can build on, right? So when a building goes up to the very edge of what it's allowed to, it's at the very edge of its setback. They're doing that because they're trying to make some money. And so if all the setbacks look the same in a neighborhood, all the buildings start to look the same as they encroach on that setback. And so profit motive and ROI are our fourth explainer for why our buildings kind of look the same. Finally, let's round it out with zoning, design standards, design review, kind of this other half of the government side.
So zoning exists because this has been found, in the United States, that zoning is a fair use of the state's police power to impose regulations that restrict what you can do with your land. And so that does eventually kind of run out. You can't make somebody under the sort of penalty of arresting them build a specific project with their money for no reason, right? That's not what police do. That's something else. But you can then say, okay, this type of use can be here, that type of, height can be here. We can sort of fairly regulate the height of buildings because we want to preserve sunlight access or whatever. And you very quickly move from just, you can keep a factory over there and you can have a home over here to, and the factory can be this tall and the home has to have this much lawn in front. But every city has arrived at a different kind of calculation for that. Denver actually has fairly permissive minimum lot sizes already. We made a reform in 2010 that allowed you to build a house on a smaller lot. That was a zoning reform that then meant that you're seeing houses that are kind of, again, a little boxier because they are on smaller lots and they're trying to sort of make the most square footage with those lots. Zoning is a real lever that you or I or policymakers can kind of pull and advocate for to sort of change how buildings look. If you're proposing a building in an 8-story zone or 12-story zone, but it is considerably cheaper and a demonstrated return on investment to just build a 5/1 and build something that's 6 stories tall total. I have a lot of people on Twitter that are yelling at me, why aren't they building 12 stories? It's because they know that they can get a return on investment for building this kind of lower, shorter thing, because there's sort of cheaper materials available. Zoning wasn't actually the constraint there, but for a lot of places in the city, zoning is a constraint. On certain key corridors, like on Pearl Street and other kind of small neighborhood corridors, oftentimes the zoning restricts you to being 2 stories because we want to kind of match the stuff that's there before. Design standards and guidelines, again, another place where possible reforms can happen. So in 2023, I think it was, in Washington, they passed a state law that required all design standards to just be standards. Everything is a objective standard that can be sort of measured and determined if somebody is in compliance. So in the world of design standards and guidelines, there is should and shall, right? And so shall is objective. The building shall be this close to the street or shall be no further than this distance from the street. Should is then kind of the world of administrators and boards that are saying yes or no. Denver really does not have that many design advisory boards, and the design advisory boards do not stop people from complaining about how the buildings look. So that is not a magic pill that can solve the problem, nor is removing it going to be sort of the thing that solves the problem of how the buildings, why they all look the same.
And so the zoning and design standards are kind of guardrails around what you can do, right? Why do many neighborhoods in Denver kind of all look the same? Well, it's because 77% of our land in Denver is zoned for single unit construction, right? You're going to have a lot of the same types of buildings built there as a result. And when an area has changed its zoning standards, then that area is going to change as a result, and things are going to start to look the same if they were rezoned in a similar era.
I'll say this as maybe a heuristic. Zoning describes the basic shape of what a building could be. The building code describes what that building can be made of. The profit motive describes why anybody would build that building in the first place. The architectural constraints are who is helping you make a decision about how and in what way the building performs. The fact that there are only certain materials available is like a real constraint about actually how the building is going to look and be made. And so each of these things creates the box that you are imagining in your mind that your kid draws with a little triangle over top, which is the house or the building or the skyscraper. Every building can basically be explained by just sort of looking at these constraints. There are zany buildings, again, as we said. There are idiosyncratic reasons that a building looks the way it does. I used to live by Orlando, Florida, and there was a church that was building themselves kind of like a skyscraper. It's known in Florida as the eyesore on I-4.
Nice.
This particular church didn't believe in taking out debt. Like they didn't believe in sort of being in debt. And so the building was being built incrementally. Over like 20 years, they were slowly constructing more and more and more of this skyscraper. But it was like this kind of just slowly, bit by bit by bit by bit, this building was sort of being completed as the sort of church had the money to build more of it. That's weird.
Yeah, very odd.
That's not a zoning constraint or anything else. That's just because like wacky people live out there in the world. Edge cases like that always exist, but that's not really the reason the buildings look the way they do.
This was a really good kind of high-level explanation, 5 key points of why our buildings tend to converge around similar shapes, similar facades, that kind of thing. And there are absolutely, aesthetic tastes that people bring when they're looking at a building. But there's often like a level of almost morality that people bring to this, which is a bit absurd. And I think that this is like where we as urbanists need to push back, right? I personally, James, likes brick buildings. I think they're pretty. But when I see a new building go up in my neighborhood that has a brick facade, that building was not built better. That building was not built higher quality or meant to last longer. That building was built identically to the building that uses vinyl siding as a facade. And it just used a different facade that I like. And people tend to conflate the nicer looking thing to them with that building being better. And it just isn't. A building is there to meet some specific purpose. And in general, if you're trying to meet a specific purpose, you're going to do it the same as anyone else, with maybe a little flourish here or there to change how it looks from the outside.
If we lived in a city that put aesthetics on the sort of top of the pedestal to the detriment of everything else, we would have a city that wasn't able to sort of open up new health clinics. Right. We would have a city where you couldn't have any new jobs because all the warehouses had to be built somewhere else. I mean, like, it is just not a reasonable thing to say that because the buildings are ugly, we shouldn't build them. Additionally, like, there's like really famous examples, for instance, brownstones in Brooklyn. Like, at the time that the brownstones were being built, they were a specific solution for how to build a certain type of housing kind of efficiently in a given building envelope with available materials and at a reasonable return on investment. And people hated the brownstones. They thought that they were ugly and stupid. And now we just like know them as kind of a classic element of Brooklyn and sort of how you know you're in Brooklyn, New York.
It's important for us to ground our conversations not in whether these buildings are ugly to you, but whether they are meeting the needs for your neighborhood and for the people who need to live and work there.
Yeah, I mean, I have a favorite architect in Denver. I'm going to shout them out. Meridian 105. Like, genuinely, I think that architecture firm does really good work in Denver. I don't think that Meridian 105 should have exclusive contracts for every single new building that's built in Denver. Look them up. They do good stuff. A lot of stuff on the north side. But I don't think that those folks are the only people that deserve to build new buildings in Denver, because I think a lot more people deserve to like live, work, do business. And the fact that we allow a lot of buildings to happen then means that when we need a new building to happen, a health clinic or affordable housing or something like that, we actually already have a kit of parts that can be pretty easily assembled for like a fairly low cost in order to deliver a public good for people. You know, in a world where only rich people or sort of moneyed interests could build something that looked good enough or was sort of quote unquote built with quality materials such that it sort of appeased passersby, we would have an impoverished city of passersby who have no place to go for the needs of their own, and just a city built for the wealthy. So, you know, like the aesthetics argument is something we don't spend a lot of time on. Past guest on the show, Ken Schruppel, blog partner of mine, Ryan Dravitz, they've always said, you know, on Denver Infill, that another truth of this is that most cities are built of vanilla, just standard buildings. You don't really notice most houses on a block. And it's normal. It's okay. You go to any of the great cities of the world, you know, your favorite place that you love so much, or the place you went on vacation last, the vast majority of the buildings are actually like really not that interesting, beautiful, but they are functional. And the function matters. And we will get superlatives. I think a lot of people really like the Populous Hotel and are really fascinated about that. In the 2016 Westward article, like railing against all of the new buildings being constructed, he praised a series of museums. One of them is one of the museums where I work. Ooh. So, you know, like those buildings will continue to be built to some higher aspiration that fulfills some different purpose or sort of some different motive.
And fundamentally, if we want to be a city that has really interesting architecture, the key is to just keep building more stuff. Because a Populous Hotel will pop up. And you know what building probably is going to get historically preserved in our lifetimes? The Populous Hotel, right? It's not going to be any other hotel that is just, you know, the Hilton somewhere else in the city. But when the time comes and the Populous Hotel is beyond its useful life, we are going to historically preserve that. And that is going to change the nature of our city and the built form of our city forevermore. The way that we have a more interesting, architecturally diverse city is just to continue building.
100%.
So, dear listener, keep on building.
Thanks for listening. The Denver Urbanism Podcast is a production of longtime blog Denver Urbanism and sister blog Denver Infill. We look forward to hearing what you have to say online. Sneeze. Okay.
No.
You good?
I don't need to sneeze.